The sky above Coruscant was a lattice of neon lights, advertisements, and hovering patrol craft. But for Loki, it felt empty, foreign, and brimming with possibility. One moment he had been mid-illusion on Asgard, twisting the fates of mortals and gods alike. The next, the very fabric of reality had shivered and pulled him through an unseen tear. He had fallen for what felt like an eternity, tumbling through a void of glimmering lights and distant echoes, until gravity, or something like it, claimed him. He landed in a narrow street amid the lower levels of the city, rolling with the grace of a trained warrior, his long green and gold cloak flaring in the sudden gust of displaced air. Around him, the denizens of Coruscant went about their business. Humans, Twi'leks, Rhodians, and myriad others hustled through the marketplace, pausing only briefly to glance at the odd flash of light or the strange figure crouched atop a railing. A dozen market droids whirred past, scanning the streets, their sensors blinking red with readings they could not explain. Loki's emerald eyes glinted with amusement. The rules of this world were different, yet easily readable to one who delighted in manipulation. Here was a new stage, a new audience, and most importantly, new pawns. He tested the ambient energy around him with a flick of his wrist, creating a small illusion of a spectral fox darting across the street. It shimmered oddly, fragments of the Force tugging at its edges, making it waver in ways that would have never happened on Midgard or Asgard. He chuckled softly. "Huh. You fight back, don't you?" The Force itself seemed to whisper around him, subtle yet insistent, and interfering with his illusions in a way that demanded adaptation. A small thrill ran through him. This world was alive, and it responded. The first humans who noticed the fox illusion shrieked, backing away in panic, which drew the attention of nearby Imperial sensors. Within minutes, the unmistakable hum of patrol droids filled the air. Loki, ever adaptable, shifted his form, adopting the guise of a scruffy street performer with a crooked smile and calculating eyes. He let a brief stream of illusions ripple through the crowd, phantoms of fire, shifting shadows, spectral duplicates, and observed with delight as panic rippled through the streets. The stormtroopers arrived seconds later, scanning and firing brief stun beams that passed harmlessly through his phantasms. "Fascinating," he murmured. The illusions wavered but held, and in the confusion, Loki vanished into the shadows. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and performed with a flair that left those who glimpsed him questioning their senses. Above him, in the Imperial palace, the dark corridors whispered with the subtle currents of the Force. Emperor Palpatine, seated in his private chamber, sensed the disturbance like a distant ripple in water. It was not the usual flow of fear, ambition, or darkness he had cultivated among his officers and agents. This was different, alien, mischievous, clever, and most importantly, unbound. He did not see Loki directly. He could only feel the unusual pattern of energy, the echo of a being who could twist perception itself. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Interesting," he murmured. "A curious anomaly." Meanwhile, Loki surveyed the lower levels with a predator's eye. The city was alive with technology and bureaucracy, yet beneath it lay corruption, greed, and ambition, the perfect materials for a God of Mischief to exploit. He could see patrol droids, stormtroopers, and even a few low-ranking officers moving nervously through the streets. A single gesture, and they would follow a phantom army into chaos. A grin spread across his face. Yes, this is fertile ground. He began testing his powers, sending illusions flickering through patrol groups, creating phantom threats that moved between alleys and rooftops. The energy field that connected all living things here, the Force, interfered just enough to make him rethink some tactics. His usual illusions occasionally flickered or partially vanished when a Force-sensitive approached. But these were minor annoyances. He adapted quickly, layering multiple phantasms, adding distractions, and even using mundane objects, market stalls, crates, and signage, as tools for misdirection. Then came his first close encounter. A lone stormtrooper detachment cornered him in an alleyway, blasters trained and scanning every shadow. Loki smirked, extending a hand and summoning a phantom double that stepped forward, bowing mockingly. The troopers hesitated, unsure which was real. In a heartbeat, Loki vanished, leaving only a trickling shadow behind him. The droids recorded anomalies, the humans scattered, and Loki perched on a nearby balcony, observing. "Yes, subtlety is key," he whispered. "Chaos, but elegant chaos." As the day wore on, word of strange occurrences reached higher Imperial command. Reports of phantom armies and impossible illusions, and the inexplicable behavior of droids arrived at Tarkin's office. He frowned at the data, noting discrepancies the analysts could not reconcile. Meanwhile, the Emperor's private probes began to scan for the source of the disturbance. Somewhere in the lower city, Loki sensed this probing and allowed a faint chuckle to escape. "Ah, a puppet master sniffing out another," he mused. For all its complexity, Loki understood the rules here, or at least enough to manipulate them. He would need to learn the nuances of hyperspace travel, the limitations of Imperial technology, and, most importantly, the invisible threads of the Force that tugged at him. His illusions, while strong, required adaptation when faced with precognition or telekinesis. He made mental notes, cataloging every encounter, every misstep, and then every potential leverage point. By nightfall, the lower levels had become a canvas for his experiments. Market stalls flickered with phantom fires, pedestrians were subtly nudged into arguments or accidents, and patrols questioned their own perceptions. Loki perched atop a spire, observing the chaos with a satisfied grin. For the first time in this galaxy, he felt the thrill of being truly untethered, not a prisoner of rules, not an ally to anyone, and yet capable of bending all around him to his will. And somewhere, in the dark corridors of power above, the Emperor's attention sharpened. Something had arrived in his galaxy that could challenge order, perception, and control. And it was clever. Too clever to ignore. Loki inhaled the night air, rich with the smells of ozone, smoke, and the faint tang of machinery. His next steps would determine whether he remained a minor curiosity or became a force that could manipulate empires. "Oh, this is going to be fun," he whispered. And with that, he vanished into the shadows of Coruscant, leaving nothing but doubt, fear, and the faint echo of laughter behind. The corridors of the Imperial Palace were a maze of shadowed metal and muted lighting, designed to intimidate and disorient even the most confident visitor. Within these walls, ambition and fear intertwined like twin serpents. High-ranking officers and administrators moved with rigid precision, aware that a single misstep could result in disgrace or death. Yet even here, an anomaly had begun to ripple through the established order. Reports of a mysterious figure wreaking havoc on the lower levels of Coruscant, leaving illusions, confusion, and fear in his wake. Grand Moff Tarkin, seated at the head of a sleek hollow table, studied the incoming reports. Hollows flickered with images of what were described as spectral armies, phantasms of fire, and seemingly impossible displacements of civilians and droids. "Impossible," he muttered, fingers tapping in a steady rhythm on the table. The scanners confirmed no ship arrivals, no known weapon signatures, and yet, his gaze swept the room, landing on the assembled officers. "Something is at work in the lower sectors. I want eyes on it immediately, and for once I want results without the usual obfuscation." An Inquisitor, cloaked in the black robes of the Emperor's personal agents, inclined her head. Her eyes, pale and piercing, reflected a mind attuned to the subtleties of the Force. "I can locate the source," she said, voice calm but firm. There is a presence unlike any I have felt before, foreign, unpredictable, and clever. It resists direct detection. Tarkin's brow furrowed. Then make sure it does not resist for long. I want answers, or someone will take the blame. Meanwhile, Loki had been observing the escalating Imperial response from the shadows of a nearby skyscraper. He adjusted the cloak around his shoulders and smirked. The officer's confusion was amusing, but predictable. He had studied bureaucracy long enough to know that fear and suspicion made excellent tools for manipulation. With a subtle gesture, he sent a series of illusions flickering through the streets. False explosions, spectral duplicates, shifting shadows that mirrored the Imperial patrols. The patrols faltered, questioning their own perceptions. A troop commander barked orders, only to find his subordinates hesitating. "What in the Emperor's name?" he muttered. And stormtroopers trained for every conceivable scenario found themselves unnerved by illusions that moved in ways that defied the laws of physics, or perhaps the laws of this galaxy itself. And above it all, Loki watched, his green eyes gleaming. Every hesitation, every moment of uncertainty was a small victory. Yet he knew this game required caution. The Force tugged at him with increasing intensity, probing, testing, and occasionally interfering with his illusions. Loki's usual confidence in his abilities was tempered by this alien energy, a subtle reminder that this galaxy had rules even a god might struggle to manipulate. He adjusted accordingly, layering multiple phantasms and combining them with mundane distractions, overturned market crates, flickering hollow ads, and strategically placed droid patrols. And the result was controlled chaos, a perfect demonstration of his ingenuity. Back in the palace, the Inquisitor concentrated, extending her senses through the Force. The presence she detected was elusive, constantly shifting, as though aware of her probing. It was unlike anything she had encountered. No Jedi, no Sith, no known Force-sensitive being. "It hides, yet taunts," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. She projected her awareness outward, reaching across the city in search of patterns, anomalies, and disturbances. The Force responded with flickers, guiding her toward the shadows where Loki moved with practiced grace. Loki, sensing the probing, allowed a faint chuckle to escape. "Ah, an Inquisitor," he whispered. "And she believes she can see all? How quaint." He wove illusions with increased precision, and testing the limits of her perception. Duplicates of himself appeared in every alley, on every balcony, and even atop hovering vehicles. Each was slightly different, some smirking, some glaring, some bowing mockingly. She would detect one, perhaps two, but never all. The Inquisitor narrowed her eyes, sensing the pattern. It was intelligent, deliberate, and far more cunning than any mere street criminal or rogue Force user. Her frustration was evident, yet she pressed on, following the faintest threads through the Force. Every so often, a minor disruption, a flicker of illusion, a misplaced droid, confirmed his presence, teasing her with glimpses, but never revealing the whole picture. Loki, perched high above, considered his next move. The Empire's hierarchy was clear. Fear ruled, suspicion guided, and ambition drove action. By creating subtle fractures, he could pit officers against one another, diverting attention while he explored this new world. His first act of manipulation came swiftly. He planted illusions of a supposed traitor among the Imperial patrols, a phantom officer sabotaging droids and stirring unrest. Within minutes, the patrols began to distrust one another, arguing over reports that didn't exist, while Loki observed the chaos like a chess master analyzing pawns and knights. But Loki's curiosity extended beyond simple amusement. He studied the technology, noting the energy signatures of blasters, the patrol patterns of droids, and the communication networks linking the city's sectors. Every observation was catalogued in his mind, a blueprint for future schemes. and even the limitations of his illusions were instructive. When force-sensitive patrols passed, his duplicates flickered. When sensors focused, minor glitches appeared. All of this taught him the rules of this galaxy, its physics, its energy patterns, and its vulnerabilities. By mid-afternoon, the Imperial response escalated. Tarkin issued stricter orders, demanding that patrols double their coverage and report directly to command. Officers quarreled over strategy. Some advocated brute force, others caution. The Inquisitor continued her silent search, guided by intuition and the Force, drawing closer to Loki's location with each subtle clue he left behind. Loki, sensing the tightening net, increased the sophistication of his illusions. He created false exits, phantom patrols, and decoy disturbances, leading the Imperial forces on a chase through the city that never truly existed. Pedestrians reacted to illusions as though they were real. Droids malfunctioned, and officers found themselves arguing over phantom events. From above, Loki could see the patterns, predict responses, and adapt instantly. Each maneuver served two purposes: maintain his cover and sow confusion among the Empire's ranks. As night fell over Coruscant, the city's lights reflected off towering spires and mirrored surfaces, creating a kaleidoscope of color and shadow. Loki surveyed the streets below, feeling a thrill he hadn't experienced in ages. He had arrived in a world of order, hierarchy, and power, and already he had begun to bend it subtly to his will. The Empire's curiosity, their rigid discipline, and their reliance on technology were all levers he could manipulate. And somewhere deep within the Imperial Palace, Palpatine's probing presence grew sharper. The disturbance had reached his attention. It was no longer a minor anomaly. It was a challenge, subtle yet unmistakable, to the order he had built over decades. Loki had not yet met the Emperor directly, but already the chessboard was set. Moves had been made, pawns manipulated, and the first pieces of a galaxy-wide game were in motion. For Loki, the thrill was just beginning. Shadows stretched across Coruscant's streets, illusions flickered in every corner, and the city pulsed with confusion and uncertainty. Here was a galaxy ripe for manipulation, a stage where a God of Mischief could play unchecked, as long as he respected the subtle power of the Force. And Loki, ever adaptable, intended to learn every rule and break every one he could. Deep within the shadowed corridors of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine sat motionless before a holocron of the galaxy, his long fingers steepled, eyes narrowing as he focused on the currents of the Force. The disturbances rippling through Coruscant were subtle, but unmistakable. A presence unlike any he had felt in decades, alien, intelligent, and mischievous, twisted the Force itself in ways that were unsettling and unfamiliar. He could feel the pulse of chaos radiating from the lower levels, where stormtroopers and droids scrambled in confusion, following traces of what seemed to be illusions, but carried a hint of something more. Something not of this galaxy. Clever, Palpatine murmured to himself, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smile. You think you can play with the galaxy's order? And yet, you are already seen. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. He rose, his robes whispering across the polished floors, and extended his senses outward, probing the very shadows. The Force, his ancient ally and constant tool, responded with faint ripples, tugging at threads that were resistant, playful, and frustratingly evasive. Meanwhile, far below in the lower levels, Loki was unaware of the Emperor's focus. He had been perched atop a high spire, surveying the chaos he had sown with a mixture of delight and calculation. The patrols were exhausted, arguing over phantom threats, and civilians were whispering of ghosts and tricks in the streets. He had begun to test the limits of his powers here in this strange galaxy, creating illusions that twisted perception but also learned to adapt to the subtle interferences of the Force. When a patrol moved too predictably or a Force-sensitive individual approached, his duplicates would flicker, as though the galaxy itself resisted his manipulation. A faint ripple in the force alerted him, subtle yet distinct. Someone, or something, was probing him directly. Loki's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth tilting into a smile. "Ah, curiosity," he whispered, voice low, savoring the thrill of being observed by a mind as cunning and dangerous as his own. "And here I thought I was the only one enjoying a game today." He allowed one of his illusions to approach, a spectral version of himself bowing mockingly toward an unseen observer. The figure flickered unnaturally, almost as if it were aware that it was being observed by a power beyond the ordinary. Palpatine extended his presence, threading through the illusions and the real figure alike, testing them, pulling gently at the edges of perception. The being he sensed was clever, far more clever than any ordinary rogue or criminal. Even when manipulating physical reality, it left traces in the Force, subtle markers that betrayed its intelligence. Palpatine's interest shifted from irritation to amusement. This was not a simple pest to be crushed. This was a mind, foreign, unpredictable, and full of potential. Back in the streets, the Inquisitor continued her pursuit, threading her way through the chaos. Her senses had picked up traces of a presence that resisted categorization, neither fully dark nor entirely light, and a being of clever manipulation and cunning intellect. As she followed the threads, she sensed the influence of this newcomer on Imperial officers, droids, and even the civilians below. This entity had not yet committed to open conflict, yet its impact was undeniable. Each misstep by the patrols, each argument sparked among officers, was evidence of its skill in manipulation. Loki, sensing the probing directly through the faint pull in the Force, allowed a rare chuckle to escape. "So the Emperor himself is curious," he mused. "How delightful." He tested his illusions further, creating multiple decoy duplicates that shimmered and moved in impossible ways, weaving between rooftops, alleyways, and hovering vehicles. The duplicates were nearly perfect, yet he allowed subtle differences. A smirk here, a flicker there, just enough to amuse him, and then perhaps to test the patience of whoever was observing. The Emperor's response was subtle, but effective. Through the Force, he nudged one of Loki's illusions, forcing it to hesitate mid-step. Loki noticed immediately, recognizing the intelligence behind the intrusion. It was not brute force. It was subtle, precise, a test of his awareness and adaptability. "Impressive," Loki whispered, admiring the skill. "Very well. Then let us play." In the meantime, the Imperial officers and patrols continued to flounder in the chaos. Reports of phantom soldiers, shifting shadows, and sudden droid malfunctions flooded the communication channels. Officers argued over orders, unsure whether to confront the disturbances directly or follow protocol, which increasingly seemed inadequate. Even Tarkin, normally calm and calculating, and began to recognize the anomaly as something that could not be controlled through standard procedures. "I want eyes on this immediately," he demanded once more, his patience thinning. "And make sure you report accurately. Any false readings, and you will be held accountable." Loki's advantage grew with every misstep. He studied the patrol's patterns, noting their reliance on sensors, rigid hierarchies, and predictable responses to orders. By subtly manipulating both perception and expectation, he created an environment where the Empire undermined itself. Stormtroopers chased illusions into dead ends, officers questioned their own observations, and droids misread commands. From above, Loki orchestrated it all with the precision of a conductor, delighting in the chaos without exposing himself to direct confrontation. And yet, for all his amusement, he remained aware of the Emperor's unseen hand. Every flicker of disruption, every subtle interference in his illusions, was a reminder that he was not dealing with mere mortals. Palpatine's mind probed at the edges, testing reactions, threading through the Force with a patience that matched Loki's cunning. The God of Mischief had met his match in a galaxy he had not yet begun to understand fully, a being as calculating, as patient, and as ruthless as himself. Loki allowed the street chaos to continue for hours, carefully balancing entertainment and observation. Civilians whispered rumors of ghosts and spirits, droids reported impossible malfunctions, and stormtroopers reported sightings of figures that could not exist. All the while, he maintained a careful awareness of the Force's interference, adapting each illusion and manipulation to account for the unseen pull of a power he had never encountered. By the end of the day, the Emperor's attention had not waned. Palpatine's presence hovered over Coruscant, probing and testing the newcomer. Loki, perched atop the highest spire in the lower levels, looked out over the city with a mixture of amusement, respect, and anticipation. This was no ordinary challenge. This was a game worthy of his talents. And games, for Loki, were never about simple victory. They were about control, manipulation, and proving one's superiority over those who believed themselves untouchable. In the shadows, he whispered to himself, "Very well, Emperor. I see you, and I will see just how far your patience stretches." The first moves had been made, the pawns were in motion, and the game, a galaxy-spanning, a mind-bending contest, had only just begun. Loki moved through the shadows of Coruscant with the practiced grace of a predator in unfamiliar terrain, yet he never rushed. The city beneath him was a living organism of steel and energy, a network of patrols, bureaucrats, and civilians, all feeding into the perfect environment for manipulation. The stormtroopers were predictable, droids were rigid, and the officers above were arrogant in their hierarchy, all of them pawns in a game he had only just begun to play. He paused atop a high balcony overlooking a square where Imperial officers were arguing over phantom threats and droid malfunctions. The illusions he had planted earlier had thrown them into disarray, and the discord was exquisite. With a subtle wave of his hand, he caused the shadows around the officers to flicker unnaturally. Each flicker suggested a presence in the room, and a whisper of sabotage or treachery. One officer glanced at another, suspicion curling in his eyes. A command was barked, but it was immediately countered by another officer questioning orders. The effect was instantaneous: confusion, hesitation, and distrust. Loki chuckled softly, delighting in the subtle fractures he had planted. Yet he understood the limitations of his influence. The Force was a constant tug at the edges of his illusions, reminding him that this galaxy had rules he could not fully bend. Still, the weaknesses inherent in human nature, fear, ambition, pride, were ripe for exploitation, and exploiting them was a kind of art he excelled at. He shifted his approach, moving from simple illusions to strategic manipulation. By altering subtle data streams within the Empire's communication network, just enough to suggest missing patrols or falsified reports, he created the impression of systemic failure. Officers questioned each other, divisions formed, and Tarkin's carefully maintained order began to show cracks. Loki's interventions were never overt. They were invisible nudges, delicate threads that, when pulled, caused chaos without anyone noticing the hand behind it. In a nearby industrial sector, Loki extended his influence further. Coruscant's factories were heavily monitored by Imperial administrators, yet even here he found vulnerabilities. By manipulating perception and timing, he caused minor malfunctions in droid production lines and energy management systems, all while remaining invisible. And the subtle disruptions were enough to spark internal investigations, drawing attention away from him and spreading his influence across multiple districts simultaneously. Meanwhile, Palpatine observed these disturbances with quiet amusement. The threads of chaos Loki had woven were impressive, yet the Emperor saw potential beyond mere mischief. He allowed the God of Mischief to operate, probing subtly through the Force, studying how the newcomer adapted, and noting the cleverness of his manipulations. Loki's ability to remain unseen while sowing discord fascinated Palpatine, though he did not underestimate the threat. Loki's interactions with the Empire were not purely manipulative, he also tested its power. In one instance, he allowed a patrol of stormtroopers to corner one of his illusions, observing how they responded to perceived threats. The illusion's flicker was just enough to make the troopers hesitate, forcing them to question their own perception. Loki remained hidden above, making mental notes. The Empire's discipline was impressive, yet predictable. Its strength was in numbers, its weakness in hierarchy and rigidity. His influence extended beyond officers and patrols. Loki began interacting with the bureaucrats and administrators, planting small suggestions that seemed innocuous but guided decisions in ways that served his growing agenda. Contracts were subtly altered, supply lines misdirected, and reports subtly skewed. The chaos, though invisible to most, was undeniable to anyone paying close attention, and Loki delighted in it, savoring the feeling of unseen control. As the day wore on, Loki's understanding of the Force grew. He noticed how it interfered with his illusions, nudging them, testing them, and occasionally exposing his presence to Force-sensitive individuals. This interference became a tool rather than a hindrance. He learned to adapt, using subtle timing, layering illusions, and combining mundane distractions with magic to confuse even those attuned to the Force. Each small adaptation strengthened his understanding of the galaxy, allowing him to operate more boldly while remaining elusive. The Imperial response, meanwhile, grew increasingly frantic. Reports of sabotage, phantom sightings, and strange malfunctions flooded Tarkin's offices. Officers argued over strategies, some advocating brute force, others cautious investigation. The Inquisitor continued her silent pursuit, threading through the city in search of the source of the disturbance. Yet every probe she made, every observation she attempted, was subtly misdirected by Loki's carefully placed illusions and manipulations. By evening, the chaos had spread across multiple districts. Patrols no longer trusted their sensors, officers questioned one another, and the factory sectors were in disarray. Loki perched atop a spire overlooking the city, surveying his work with satisfaction. The city had become a living puzzle, and he had placed the pieces in just the right positions to cause maximum confusion. Even as he reveled in his success, Loki remained aware of the Emperor's subtle presence. Palpatine's probing was constant, testing him, observing him, and nudging the boundaries of his manipulation. Loki welcomed the challenge. And the game had become more than mere amusement. It was now a contest of intellect and cunning between two of the galaxy's most dangerous minds. As night fell over Coruscant, the city below shimmered with lights and shadows, a complex web of chaos that Loki had carefully woven. Stormtroopers chased phantom enemies, officers argued over non-existent threats, and civilians whispered rumors of ghosts and trickery. From his vantage point, Loki smiled, knowing that he had only begun to scratch the surface of what was possible in this galaxy. And somewhere, in the depths of the Imperial Palace, Palpatine's dark eyes watched, calculating, waiting, and preparing for the moment when he would engage directly with this clever and dangerous newcomer. Loki's voice echoed softly in the shadows, almost to himself, and almost to the galaxy. The Empire is mine to play with, if only for now. Coruscant was a city of lights and shadows, but even in the vast expanse of the lower levels, disturbances in the Force rippled like faint tremors through the galaxy. Jedi who had survived Order 66 had gone into hiding, often operating as ghost-like protectors of civilians or seeking knowledge that had not yet been extinguished. One such survivor, a young Jedi Knight named Kalen Vey, felt the subtle tug of an unfamiliar presence, clever and unnervingly deliberate, weaving chaos across the streets below. Kalen crouched atop a narrow spire, the wind whipping around his cloak, senses attuned to every pulse of energy around him. The Force had never guided him toward such deception. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and illusions twisted perception with an artistry that was almost playful. And yet, Kalen knew instinctively that the Source was no ordinary manipulator. The presence was intelligent, calculating, and experienced. His grip tightened on the hilt of his lightsaber, the hum of the blade a comforting resonance in the otherwise chaotic streets. Below, Loki continued his subtle orchestration. Illusions danced in every alley and across the rooftops. Stormtroopers hesitated as phantom enemies flickered past. Officers argued over non-existent threats, and civilians whispered rumors of spirits and trickery. Every move had been calculated to spread confusion, but Loki sensed the Jedi's approach, not through sight, but through the peculiar tug in the Force that resisted his usual influence. "Ah," Loki murmured, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Another player enters the stage. How charming." He adapted instantly, layering illusions with subtle imperfections that allowed Kalen to sense them, but not locate them. A spectral duplicate bowed mockingly in the Jedi's direction, then flickered and vanished. Kalen's senses flared with recognition. The being was testing him, taunting him, yet unwilling to commit to open confrontation. The Jedi narrowed his eyes, considering his options. He could confront directly, risking exposure, or track the disturbances cautiously, following the traces of manipulation with patience and precision. Kalen chose patience. The Force guided him toward areas of concentrated disruption, markets where phantom fires erupted, alleys where shadows moved independently, and patrols that seemed unsure of their orders. Each anomaly was a breadcrumb, a subtle indication of Loki's presence. And the Jedi noted patterns in the chaos, inconsistencies in patrol responses, repeated illusions in similar locations, and faint traces of energy that pulsed through the Force in ways that suggested intelligence and mischief. Loki, observing from a rooftop, allowed the Jedi to follow. The game had shifted. It was no longer simply about causing chaos, it was about testing the mettle of a competent adversary. He moved like a shadow among shadows, a phantom orchestrating disturbances while simultaneously learning from his opponent. "Clever little Jedi," he whispered, persistent, cautious, and yet predictable. The Inquisitor, still threading through the lower levels, sensed the Jedi's presence as well. She paused, recognizing a rare and dangerous anomaly. A Force sensitive actively pursuing Loki. This added complexity to her mission. And she could not confront both the God of Mischief and a Jedi simultaneously, yet she could use the Jedi as a tool, a distraction to weaken Loki's control over the city. Palpatine's interest deepened. The chessboard had gained a new piece, and each move now carried higher stakes. Loki's first real test came when Kalen cornered what appeared to be an illusion in a deserted plaza. As the Jedi ignited his lightsaber, the spectral figure split into 3, then 6, each flickering with subtle differences in stance and expression. Kalen focused, sensing through the Force that only one was real, yet unable to pinpoint which. His saber sliced through a phantom, only for it to dissipate harmlessly. The real Loki, perched above on a balcony, watched with barely concealed amusement. "Interesting," Loki muttered. "I'm allowing the illusion to bow mockingly before disappearing." He had anticipated the Jedi's approach, testing both his ability to create believable illusions and his ability to read the Force. Each encounter was a learning experience, revealing the Jedi's instincts, methods, and limitations. The game was as much about observation as manipulation. Kalen paused, closing his eyes briefly to meditate through the Force. The illusions persisted, subtle hints guiding him, challenges meant to provoke thought and testing his resolve. He sensed the underlying intelligence and cunning, the pattern behind the chaos. This was no mindless trickster. This was a being of considerable power, capable of adapting to the Force in ways that were rare, even among Jedi adversaries. Across the city, patrols continued to falter under Loki's influence. Stormtroopers hesitated, droids malfunctioned, and Imperial officers argued endlessly over reports. Loki's manipulations were subtle yet pervasive, demonstrating mastery over perception, timing, and psychological influence. He combined illusions with small acts of environmental disruption. Crates toppled, holoads flickered, and power conduits sparked, creating minor but effective distractions that amplified the chaos. The Jedi's pursuit intensified. Kalen sensed patterns in Loki's illusions, small imperfections, repetitions, and deliberate clues. The Force tugged him toward the rooftop corridors and hidden alleys where Loki had staged the most elaborate disturbances. The God of Mischief, sensing the narrowing net, prepared for more direct engagement. He allowed the Jedi to approach, and knowing that an encounter would reveal strengths and weaknesses, both of his opponent and his own in this alien galaxy. Their first direct confrontation occurred atop a high spire, illuminated by the neon glow of Coruscant's lights. Loki stepped from the shadows, his green cloak flaring dramatically, and tilted his head with a sardonic smile. "Ah, so the little Jedi has come to play," he said, voice dripping with charm and amusement. "I must admit, I've been waiting for this." Kalen ignited his lightsaber fully, the blue blade humming with resonance. "I've felt your presence. Your manipulations end tonight," he declared, eyes narrowing. The Force around them rippled, tension crackling in the air like static. Loki's illusions shimmered briefly, then dissolved, leaving only him. He did not attack immediately, and choosing instead to size up the Jedi, studying his stance, energy, and confidence. "You overestimate what you can control," Loki said smoothly. "This city, these people, the Empire, they are all malleable. You, however, are persistent. That makes you dangerous." He allowed a flick of his wrist, creating 3 phantom duplicates around them, each moving independently, each indistinguishable from the real Loki. The Jedi's eyes darted, focus sharpening as he tried to sense through the illusions using the Force. The confrontation was a delicate dance, testing perception, reaction, and adaptability. Kalen struck at the duplicates, moving with precision, but each attack dissolved harmlessly. Loki observed, noting how the Jedi filtered through the illusions, how he adapted, and how he responded to the unpredictability of this alien manipulation. "Clever," Loki whispered under his breath. Yes, this is going to be fun." The encounter ended without physical confrontation, but both participants had learned much. Loki now understood the Jedi's strengths and instincts. The Jedi gained a sense of Loki's cunning and adaptability, and both recognized that this was only the beginning, an opening move in a contest that would span the entire city, the entire planet, and perhaps the entire galaxy. As the night deepened, Loki retreated into the shadows, leaving the Jedi atop the spire, contemplating the unusual intelligence he had just encountered. Below, the Empire continued to flounder, patrols chasing phantoms, officers arguing, and civilians whispering of ghosts and spirits. The game had grown in complexity, introducing a new player who could challenge Loki's illusions and perhaps disrupt his carefully orchestrated chaos. In the shadows, Loki whispered, "The Jedi, persistent, cautious, and surprisingly competent. Excellent. Now the real game begins." And with that, he melted into the darkness, leaving Coruscant's lights flickering in his wake and the faintest echo of mischief behind him. The corridors of power in the Imperial Palace were suffocating in their formality. Crystal chandeliers reflected the cold gleam of polished metal floors, and the air carried a faint scent of ozone from the constant hum of energy conduits beneath the city's surface. For most officers, the palace was a place of awe and fear, where whispers of promotion or dismissal could seal their fates. But for Loki, it was another playground, a canvas of ambition, pride, and bureaucracy waiting to be exploited. From his hidden vantage points, Loki observed the ebb and flow of imperial politics with the patience of a god accustomed to chess games that spanned centuries. He had studied the city below for days, noting patterns in patrol schedules, administrative procedures, and the relationships between officers, senators, and the Inquisitor. Every quarrel, and every ego-driven decision and every minor failure was a lever he could pull to influence outcomes without revealing himself. His first target was a cluster of high-ranking officers responsible for the deployment of patrols in Coruscant's lower sectors. Using subtle illusions and carefully planted suggestions, Loki manipulated communications, making reports appear more urgent or misleading. In one instance, a minor equipment failure, a power surge in the monitoring grid, was magnified through illusion into what seemed like evidence of sabotage by a rival officer. Within hours, accusations flew, alliances shifted, and mistrust spread like wildfire. Officers who had previously coordinated seamlessly now questioned each other's loyalty. Loki's manipulations were subtle enough to evade direct detection, and yet precise enough to create genuine consequences. Tarkin, already frustrated by the persistent disturbances, was forced to intervene personally, issuing directives that were inconsistent and contradictory, further amplifying the confusion. Loki noted every hesitation, every flawed order, and every reaction. The Empire was structured to resist overt threats, but was vulnerable to the quiet erosion of trust. Meanwhile, the Inquisitor had tracked the Jedi Kalen Vay's pursuit through the lower levels and sensed the growing tension among the Imperial officers. She realized that the mysterious presence manipulating both the city and the Empire's hierarchy was exceptionally clever, and she reported her findings to Palpatine. The Emperor, seated in his throne room, listened with keen interest. "Clever," he murmured, then his voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. "This one is more than a mere distraction. Let us see how long their arrogance lasts." The Inquisitor continued to follow the trail, noting subtle hints of manipulation that suggested Loki's deeper understanding of the Empire's internal mechanisms. By creating tension between officers, he effectively turned the bureaucracy into an extension of his will, all without exposing himself. Palpatine's interest grew as he observed the unfolding events. A being capable of exploiting both perception and institutional weakness could be an asset or a threat. Loki, perched in shadowed alcoves high above the administrative floors, studied the Emperor's subtle presence in the Force, detecting hints of interest and probing curiosity. He allowed controlled disturbances to ripple through the officer ranks, each designed to test the limits of loyalty, discipline, and patience. One officer, convinced of betrayal within his own division, began to take unilateral action, further destabilizing the hierarchy. Loki observed silently, noting how easily ambition could be manipulated when guided by fear and uncertainty. But Loki's actions were not purely tactical. They were also an art form. He carefully balanced chaos with structure, ensuring that his manipulations remained subtle enough to avoid immediate detection while exerting maximum influence over the decision-making process. By creating minor crises, he forced officers to act in ways that revealed their weaknesses, their priorities, and their vulnerabilities. Each reaction was cataloged, analyzed, and stored for future use. Across Coruscant, the Jedi Kalen Vay continued his pursuit. The Force tugged him toward the epicenter of the disturbances, where bureaucratic chaos and street-level illusions intersected. He recognized that this was no ordinary manipulator. The pattern of influence extended beyond street-level mischief into the highest echelons of the Empire itself. The presence he sensed was deliberate, strategic, and almost audacious in its reach. Loki allowed Kalen a glimpse of his power, carefully controlling the exposure. A holographic report flickered in the administration chamber, displaying false evidence of supposed traitors and sabotage. The Jedi sensed the manipulation, but could not yet locate its source. This dance of perception and misdirection became increasingly complex, with Loki always one step ahead, orchestrating both physical and bureaucratic illusions to test, amuse, and manipulate his observers. Even Tarkin, a man renowned for his discipline and strategic mind, found himself outmaneuvered. Reports conflicted, patrols failed, and the chain of command fractured. Loki's interventions had created an environment where trust was scarce, and decisive action was hampered by uncertainty. The Emperor, observing through the Force, took note of these subtle fractures, intrigued by the effectiveness of Loki's methods. In the streets below, civilians whispered of strange phenomena, shadows that moved independently, figures appearing and disappearing, and minor disturbances that seemed to defy natural explanation. The chaos was both psychological and tactical. By affecting perception, Loki ensured that the Empire's forces remained off balance, chasing ghosts while the true architect of the disruption observed silently. Loki's manipulation extended beyond officers and patrols to the bureaucrats controlling vital logistics. Shipments of supplies were subtly delayed, minor miscommunications were amplified, and minor financial discrepancies were introduced into the records. Each small disruption was invisible on its own, but together they created a ripple of inefficiency that threatened to slow even the Empire's well-oiled machinery. Loki's genius lay in his subtlety. He never forced failure but guided it with invisible hands, allowing the Empire's own weaknesses to amplify his influence. As night fell over the city, Loki reflected on the day's successes. Coruscant was a web of confusion, fear, and uncertainty, perfectly manipulated from the shadows. Officers had been deceived. The patrols had faltered, and the bureaucracy itself had begun to fracture under the pressure of his subtle interventions. Yet the most intriguing challenge remained, the Emperor himself and the Jedi who pursued him. Each had observed fragments of his power, and each represented both a threat and an opportunity. Loki allowed a rare smile to cross his face. The Empire, pliable, predictable, and utterly human, he murmured. And now, the real game begins. With the city under his subtle influence, and the Emperor and Jedi fully aware of his presence, the stakes had risen. He would need to balance mischief, strategy, and diplomacy in ways he had rarely attempted. Every move now had consequences, and every action would be scrutinized by beings capable of extraordinary insight. Above it all, the neon lights of Coruscant flickered, casting shadows that danced across rooftops and alleyways. In these shadows, Loki prowled, unseen yet omnipresent, orchestrating a symphony of chaos that stretched from the streets to the palace. He was no longer merely a trickster. He was a strategist, a manipulator, and a force the Empire had never anticipated. Coruscant's underlevels were a labyrinth of steel and neon, a maze of shadows, alleyways, and ventilation shafts. The chaos Loki had orchestrated stretched across districts, seeding confusion and mistrust among the Empire's ranks. But now, amid the swirling illusions and whispered rumors of ghostly tricksters, the Jedi Kalen Vey had finally cornered him. Or so he believed. The Force guided Kalen with precision, but even his finely tuned senses were challenged by the God of Mischief. Every alley held a phantasm, every shadow flickered with impossible movement, and even the air seemed to shift unnaturally around Loki's presence. The Jedi ignited his lightsaber, the blue blade humming with focused energy, casting sharp reflections off the metal walls. Every step he took was measured, every breath controlled, and every flicker of perception filtered through the Force. Loki, perched atop a high balcony overlooking a narrow street, allowed the Jedi to follow him. The God of Mischief's green cloak fluttered in the faint wind, and his expression was one of mild amusement. "Ah, persistent, aren't we?" Loki murmured, almost to himself, almost to the city itself. "I do love an audience that appreciates subtlety." Without warning, Loki dropped into the street below, his presence simultaneously tangible and illusory. 3 phantom duplicates materialized alongside him, each identical in stance, expression, and timing. Kalen swung his lightsaber in a controlled arc, slicing through one duplicate only to have it dissipate harmlessly. The Jedi's eyes darted, analyzing energy signatures through the Force, seeking the real Loki amid the illusions. "You can't hide forever," Kalen said, voice firm and resonant. "Your tricks won't stop me." "Oh, my dear Jedi," Loki replied smoothly, tilting his head with mock innocence. "I'm not hiding. I'm performing." The battle was a dance of perception and instinct. Kalen lunged, slashing through illusions with precise movements, each strike guided by the Force. But Loki anticipated, adapting his duplicates in real time, flickering between alleyways, vaulting onto rooftops, and using environmental hazards to confuse the Jedi. Sparks erupted from damaged power conduits, crates toppled unexpectedly, and overhead cables swayed dangerously, all orchestrated to provide subtle misdirection. Kalen paused, centering himself in the Force, sensing the underlying intelligence guiding the chaos. This was no ordinary trickster. The presence was cunning, thus strategic, and aware of every subtle motion. Even as he struck at illusions, Kalen began to feel the faint tug of Loki's manipulation, a pulse of energy that suggested not just mischief, but deliberate control over perception and environment. Loki allowed himself a rare grin, enjoying the challenge. "You are surprisingly competent," he whispered under his breath. "Clever, cautious, yet still bound by rules. Rules I enjoy testing." With a flick of his wrist, more illusions appeared, blending seamlessly with the environment. Kalen's lightsaber cut through one, then another, but the real Loki remained elusive, shifting subtly with each movement. The Jedi adapted, relying on the Force to discern truth from illusion. He closed his eyes briefly, extending his senses beyond sight, beyond sound, into the very currents of energy that pulsed through the city. He felt Loki's presence as a series of threads, some real, some false, twisting and turning. With practiced focus, he began to isolate the true thread, moving with deliberate precision toward the genuine target. Loki noticed the shift immediately. The thrill of a worthy adversary ignited a spark of respect in him. "Ah, I do enjoy a challenge," he said aloud, leaping to a nearby rooftop to maintain distance while keeping the Jedi in pursuit. He allowed a momentary lapse in illusion, just enough for Kalen to glimpse him clearly. The recognition was fleeting, but it ignited determination in the Jedi's movements. Their confrontation escalated into a series of strategic maneuvers across rooftops, alleys, and abandoned factory spaces. Loki utilized every tool at his disposal: illusion, environmental manipulation, and subtle psychological nudges, while the Jedi relied on the Force, intuition, and careful observation. Sparks flew, crates toppled, and holographic advertisements flickered erratically as the city became a theater of their duel. For every illusion Loki created, Kalen responded with heightened focus, striking with precision that revealed gaps in the duplicates and subtle inconsistencies in timing. Each encounter was brief but intense, the balance of skill, perception, and adaptability shifting with every moment. Both participants learned from each movement, the Jedi noting the patterns in Loki's manipulation, and Loki adjusting in real time to counter the Jedi's insight. At one point, Loki feigned retreat into a narrow ventilation shaft, recreating a phantom that darted elsewhere. Kalen leapt, slicing through the illusion, only to discover that the real Loki had already repositioned himself to an advantageous location. The dance continued, a high-stakes game that blurred the line between reality and trickery. Eventually, the Jedi realized that direct confrontation alone would not succeed. He needed to anticipate Loki's strategy, using the Force to influence not just perception, but the environment itself. He extended his energy through the Force, subtly shifting the flow of air, the alignment of debris, and the tension in cables above. Each move constrained Loki's options, forcing the trickster to adapt more carefully. Loki noticed the change immediately. "Ah, I see," he said, voice carrying faint amusement. "The game evolves. Very well." He adjusted his strategy, and incorporating rapid shifts, overlapping illusions, and calculated risks, creating an ever-changing battlefield. Every action had consequences, and every movement tested both cunning and adaptability. The confrontation reached a critical moment atop a high spire. Kalen had isolated Loki's true presence using the Force, and the trickster realized that the Jedi's persistence had narrowed his options. The city's lights below flickered, casting elongated shadows, while the hum of distant machinery underscored the tension. Loki faced the Jedi directly, evaluating his opponent with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You are more than I anticipated," Loki said. "Persistent, clever, and morally constrained. That will make this interesting." Kalen's response was simple and firm. "Enough games. I will not allow your manipulations to harm this city, or its people, any longer." Loki smirked. "Oh, I don't harm. Not directly. I guide, I suggest. I amuse. But tell me, Jedi, can you stop the ripple I've already begun?" The question lingered in the air, charged with unspoken truth. Every illusion, every manipulated officer, and every disrupted patrol was a thread in a larger web, one that had already changed the city in ways that could not be undone. Kalen's jaw tightened, recognizing that stopping Loki entirely might be impossible, but countering him, challenging him, and containing the chaos was within reach. The standoff continued, a balance of patience, skill, and intellect. Both adversaries understood that this was a duel not of sheer force, but of mind, perception, and adaptability. And though neither could claim outright victory yet, the stage was set for an escalation that would stretch the limits of both combat and cunning. As Loki melted into the shadows once more, leaving Kalen to survey the remnants of the illusions, both participants understood the unspoken truth. The battle was far from over. Each had glimpsed the other's capability, each had learned, and each had adapted. Coruscant had become a theater for a contest that could ripple across the galaxy, and neither Loki nor Kalen would back down. Loki's voice echoed faintly from the darkness, almost to the city itself. "Clever, determined, delightful. But this is only the beginning, and soon we will see how the real game unfolds." The underworld of Coruscant was a tangled maze of neon-lit alleyways, industrial vents, and clandestine meeting spots. Here, the Empire's reach thinned, and shadows became a currency more valuable than credits. Loki moved through this network with confidence, his illusions providing perfect cover as he observed, manipulated, and subtly tested the allegiances of factions that rarely trusted anyone outside their own circles. His first encounter was with a band of Mandalorian mercenaries operating independently of any major faction. They were a clan of warriors known as the Viridian Blades, loyal to no one but their code and their pay. Their Beskar armor reflected dim streetlights as they tested blasters, checked comm links, and surveyed potential contracts. Loki appeared before them, unannounced, his green cloak flaring, on illusions dissipating to reveal only himself. "Ah, warriors," Loki said, tilting his head with mock curiosity. "I've heard tales of your prowess. Perhaps you could be useful." The Mandalorians responded not with words, but with disciplined stance and weapon readiness. Their leader, A woman named Vera Tal stepped forward, voice masked by her helmet's filter. "Who are you? And why should we trust you?" she demanded. Every word was measured, every motion calculated. Loki smiled faintly, understanding instinctively that trust would be earned, not commanded. "I'm a facilitator," he replied smoothly. "I offer opportunities, alliances, and a chance to manipulate outcomes in your favor, if you're willing to see the game for what it is." The Mandalorians exchanged wary glances. They had survived by being cautious, and every offer carried hidden risk. Loki, reading the subtle tension, allowed a minor illusion to flare in the background, a phantom Imperial patrol clumsily approaching. It was enough to pique their interest without directly endangering them. Vera's head tilted slightly. "You're clever, stranger, perhaps too clever, but cleverness can be useful if it aligns with skill." She gestured for her squad to relax slightly, though weapons remained ready. "We will listen." And so began a negotiation that was as much about perception as persuasion. Loki did not offer bribes or threats. He offered insight into opportunities, subtle manipulations of Imperial forces, and knowledge that could allow the Mandalorians to profit without direct conflict. His illusions, carefully controlled, demonstrated his capabilities without revealing too much. It was a calculated risk, one designed to gauge loyalty, intelligence, and ambition. Meanwhile, Kalen Vey sensed the subtle widening of Loki's influence through the Force. The Jedi could feel threads stretching outward, reaching not just the Empire but independent factions, criminals, and mercenaries. He understood immediately the danger. Loki was not content with mischief. He was building power, alliances, and leverage across multiple layers of Coruscant society. The Force warned him that waiting would be costly. Proactive measures were essential. Loki's negotiations with the Viridian Blades were delicate. He used illusions sparingly to emphasize possibilities, phantoms of Imperial patrols being subtly misdirected, minor sabotage to showcase what could be achieved, and spectral hints of opportunities that might be exploited for profit. And the Mandalorians responded cautiously, testing him with minor tasks that required cunning, precision, and secrecy. Loki completed each without revealing his true power, maintaining the balance of awe and respect he sought. Satisfied with their performance and adaptability, Loki offered a deeper proposition: cooperation on selective operations against the Empire. He did not promise loyalty or permanence. He promised advantage, influence, and the thrill of challenge. For warriors like the Mandalorians, this was irresistible. Each engagement would carry personal gain, testing their skill against forces beyond their normal experience. Next, Loki turned his attention to the city's smugglers and information brokers, networks that thrived on secrecy and opportunity. He visited a cantina hidden deep within the industrial sectors, its interior humming with quiet negotiation and shadowed deals. He introduced himself subtly, weaving minor allusions to inspire curiosity and fear without threat. Rumors spread quickly, a figure capable of bending perception, manipulating enemies, and predicting outcomes, someone worth attention, if not cautious collaboration. The smugglers were quick to offer information, guided subtly by Loki's manipulations. He learned of secret Imperial patrols, hidden cargo runs, and political rivalries that could be exploited to his advantage. In return, he offered protection, strategic insight, and minor manipulations that could assist in evading Imperial entanglements. Each alliance was transactional, practical, and mutually beneficial. Yet every connection added to Loki's growing network of influence across Coruscant. By the time the night deepened, Loki had cultivated a web of shadow alliances, Mandalorian warriors seeking tactical advantage, smugglers exchanging intelligence for protection, and even minor Imperial officials subtly redirected without realizing the hand guiding them. The city itself had become a chessboard, and Loki was aware of every move, every consequence, and every opportunity. Even Kalen Vey felt the expanding influence through the Force. Threads of manipulation were spreading like ripples in water, and while the Jedi focused on containing Loki's direct actions, the God of Mischief was building power in ways that were indirect, subtle, and exponentially more dangerous. The Jedi realized that the confrontation was no longer a single duel, but a battle for influence across multiple layers of the galaxy's social, political, and criminal networks. Loki, aware of the Jedi's attention, allowed small provocations to ripple through these new alliances. A minor Imperial patrol would be redirected into a trap of illusions, or an illusion of a rival faction would spark a small skirmish, testing the loyalty, intelligence, and adaptability of his newly recruited allies. Each event was orchestrated without direct confrontation, ensuring that the God of Mischief remained unseen, untouchable, and ever in control. By dawn, Coruscant's underworld had shifted subtly but significantly. The Mandalorians were cautious yet intrigued, smugglers trusted him as an ally of convenience, and whispers of his presence had spread through the shadows. The city itself had become a network of threads, each manipulated by Loki with precision and foresight. Above it all, he paused on a high balcony, looking over the city he had begun to mold. Neon lights reflected off his cloak, the faint wind carrying the scent of ozone and burned circuitry from previous illusions. His smile was faint, but unmistakable. "Ah, the game evolves," he whispered to the empty city, voice tinged with satisfaction. "The Empire, the Jedi, the Shadows, all pieces. And soon, the board will be complete." Even as he prepared for the next moves, he remained aware of Palpatine's subtle attention. The Emperor had noted the God of Mischief's expanding influence and was undoubtedly contemplating his own response. The Inquisitor, the Jedi, the Mandalorians, the smugglers, each was a variable in a system Loki now controlled with deft precision. And yet, the thrill of unpredictability remained, a challenge he welcomed with open arms. And the night faded, leaving Coruscant poised on the edge of transformation. The underworld had new alliances, subtle manipulations had seeded distrust among the Empire, and the Jedi's pursuit was constrained by the expanding complexity of Loki's influence. He melted into the shadows, ready to orchestrate the next stage of the game, confident that every thread he had touched now bore his signature. For Loki, the thrill was not just in control, it was in the artistry of manipulation, the balance of chaos and order, and the unfolding story that would test the limits of the Jedi, the Empire, and every shadowed faction willing to engage. The game was far from over, and the night had only just begun. By mid-morning, Coruscant's orderly hum of bureaucracy and surveillance had shifted to a tense, controlled chaos. Reports of phantom threats, sabotaged patrols, and inexplicable disturbances had reached the highest levels of the Imperial hierarchy. Tarkin paced his private office, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. For the first time, he felt the presence of something that could not be contained by conventional power or military might, a force that moved with intelligence, adaptability, and audacity. Palpatine, seated on his throne in the high tower of the Senate chamber, regarded the reports with cold amusement. "Interesting," he murmured, voice carrying across the darkened room. "A being capable of exploiting perception, manipulating resources, and eluding detection. This, Loki, will prove a test of our patience and ingenuity." The Emperor's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a rhythm echoing the subtle pulse of strategy forming in his mind. The Inquisitor had already begun tracking Loki through the lower levels and shadow networks of Coruscant, and she reported with cautious precision. "My master," she said, voice laced with restrained urgency. "He is weaving influence across independent factions, smugglers, Mandalorians, even minor officers. If left unchecked, his manipulations will become uncontainable. Palpatine's gaze hardened. Containment is insufficient. This one must be neutralized, or redirected under our control. Assemble a strike team. Jedi are scarce, but your abilities will complement mine. No illusions will be allowed to mask his presence. Orders went out swiftly. His Imperial officers, previously disoriented by Loki's subtle manipulations, were now coordinated under Tarkin's direct command. Patrols were reinforced, sector monitors recalibrated, and droid units deployed in unprecedented numbers. The Empire's response was systematic, disciplined, and ruthless, a reflection of its supreme efficiency. But the enemy they faced was not ordinary. Loki had already anticipated such a reaction, leaving calculated gaps and threads of misdirection woven through every report, every patrol path, and every officer's instructions. In the lower levels, Kalen Vey sensed the escalation through the Force. The Jedi had been tracking Loki across districts, and now the intensity of disturbances reflected a higher-order coordination. Something beyond street-level mischief was unfolding. Loki's influence had provoked a full-scale response, and the Jedi understood that this confrontation was entering a dangerous new phase. Loki, perched atop a high ventilation shaft overlooking a strategic Imperial hub, observed the preparation with characteristic amusement. He had studied the Empire's structure in detail, predicting the formation of a counterstrike even before Palpatine's orders were formalized. Every officer had a role, every patrol a predictable path, and every strategy contained vulnerabilities ripe for exploitation. With a flick of his wrist, Loki orchestrated minor disturbances that amplified confusion without revealing his position. Security droids reported phantom breaches, surveillance cameras flickered with illusory figures, and minor alarms triggered false responses in a cascade that forced human and mechanical forces alike to divide attention. Every move was carefully calculated to stretch the Empire thin, forcing mistakes while retaining full control over outcomes. The Mandalorians, smugglers, and shadowed allies Loki had cultivated began to notice the increased Imperial activity. Loki communicated subtly, using illusions, gestures, and whispered guidance to coordinate defensive maneuvers without directly revealing his full power. His allies responded with precision, executing small sabotage missions, misdirecting Imperial units, and exploiting gaps in patrol formations. The city itself became a stage of controlled chaos, orchestrated to demonstrate both influence and restraint. Kalen Vey, sensing the intensification of threat, had attempted to converge on Loki's location. The Jedi's movements were deliberate, coordinated, and guided entirely by the Force. But even Kalen struggled against the labyrinth of illusions, misdirections, and carefully staged disturbances. Each step forward was met with subtle resistance, forcing him to expend energy and focus on discerning reality from manipulation. Loki, aware of the Jedi's approach, allowed himself to observe the escalating conflict without revealing his presence fully. He noted the Jedi's increasing focus, the subtle strain on concentration, and the predictable patterns in movement, all of which could be exploited if needed. Yet he remained restrained, unwilling to commit to full engagement until the proper moment, savoring the tension of anticipation. And the first major clash occurred when an Imperial strike team descended into a district previously under Loki's subtle control. Orders were precise, units coordinated, and droid units deployed to maintain efficiency. Yet Loki had already woven minor deceptions into patrol routes, creating overlapping illusions that caused units to misinterpret threats. Officers fired upon phantom targets, droids diverted unnecessarily, and chaos erupted within the otherwise disciplined Force. Loki did not engage directly at first. Instead, he observed, calculating, noting which units adapted successfully and which faltered under pressure. His illusions were precise enough to provoke real mistakes without exposing him fully. Every misstep reinforced his understanding of Imperial strengths, weaknesses, and internal dependencies. Kalen Vey finally breached the heart of the engagement, encountering both illusions and real threats simultaneously. His lightsaber flashed with clarity as he sliced through duplicates, his movements guided by the Force. Yet even with such skill, Loki's layering of misdirection forced him to adapt continuously, challenging both perception and instinct. For the first time, Kalen recognized the scope of Loki's influence, not merely over individuals, but over the entire battlefield, a symphony of calculated chaos. Loki finally revealed himself during a direct confrontation with the Jedi and the Inquisitor in the central industrial zone. Illusions collapsed as he stepped into full visibility, his green cloak flaring dramatically. His eyes gleamed with amusement. "Ah, the full orchestra has arrived," he said. "The Jedi, the Inquisitor, and the Empire's finest, all here to witness my little symphony." The Inquisitor struck first, using Force-enhanced agility to close the distance. Loki deflected her attack with ease, combining trickery, misdirection, and raw reflexes. Blasters fired from a distance, forcing him to adapt further, creating illusions that split perception and masked movement. He was simultaneously reactive and proactive, a master of battlefield manipulation in ways the Empire had never faced. Kalen advanced, lightsaber ready, trusting the Force to guide him through deception. He struck at Loki, but illusions shifted the God of Mischief's position, forcing the Jedi to adjust mid-strike. Sparks erupted from metal beams and vent conduits as both illusions and environmental hazards played into the engagement. Each action by Loki forced adaptation, yet requiring focus, precision, and instinct from both Jedi and Inquisitor. The battle escalated, drawing in Imperial units. Loki subtly manipulated the cityscape, creating traps, misdirecting fire, and turning infrastructure against the Empire. He used shadows, holographic projections, and phantom duplicates to orchestrate a controlled chaos that forced every participant to question reality. Officers hesitated, soldiers faltered, and droids responded incorrectly, all calculated disruptions that bought Loki strategic advantage. Kalen realized the engagement required a combination of precision, insight, and strategy rather than brute force. He focused through the Force, anticipating illusions, predicting movement, and coordinating with the Inquisitor to converge on Loki's true position. The God of Mischief, sensing the narrowing net, allowed a rare display of power, a flash of energy manipulation that disrupted several droids simultaneously, confirming the danger he posed beyond mere illusions. The clash reached a critical juncture when the Jedi and the Inquisitor converged on Loki's position atop a high scaffolding. Sparks from disrupted conduits rained down, smoke swirled, and debris littered the platform. Loki's grin widened. "Ah, finally, a real test," he whispered. "All of you, working together, yet still so predictable." Every strike, every movement, every illusion was now a high-stakes gambit. The Empire's counterstrike had escalated into full engagement, yet Loki remained not only unharmed but in control, turning every attempt at containment into a demonstration of his cunning. The city itself had become his instrument, a theater of chaos, misdirection, and strategy, forcing Jedi, Inquisitor, and Imperial forces to play by his rules. Even as he maneuvered through the engagement, Loki noted subtle fractures among the Imperial forces. Officers hesitated under pressure, droids malfunctioned at critical moments, and coordination faltered, all influenced by the God of Mischief's prior manipulations. Every action had consequences, and Loki had ensured that each ripple reinforced his advantage. By the time night fell, the Imperial counterstrike had failed to contain Loki fully, though damage had been mitigated. The God of Mischief had showcased the limits of Imperial power when faced with intelligence, adaptability, and strategy. He melted into the shadows once more, leaving Kalen and the Inquisitor to contemplate the scale of his influence and the challenge yet to come. Loki's voice, it carrying faintly through hidden channels, echoed like a taunt. The Empire believes it can strike. The Jedi believe they can chase. But the game is far from over. And now, the board is fully set. The night sky above Coruscant was alive with muted neon glows and the occasional flash of distant starships, their hulls reflecting in the city's high-rise windows. The city pulsed with the tension Loki had orchestrated over weeks. Imperial officers second-guessing orders, Mandalorian mercenaries poised for action, smugglers maneuvering through alleyways, and Jedi searching tirelessly for the elusive trickster. Yet at the heart of it all, the God of Mischief moved with calm precision, every step of his plan executed flawlessly, every contingency anticipated, every thread leading to the ultimate gambit. From a hidden vantage point on a skyscraper roof, Loki surveyed the city below, a living chessboard of chaos, intrigue, and opportunity. His shadow stretched long across the roof, and flickering as nearby holographic billboards cast multicolored reflections. He had spent hours manipulating the Empire's countermeasures, subtly influencing patrols, communications, and command structures, ensuring that each faction would be drawn precisely to the points he desired. Every force, Imperial, Jedi, and Independent, was now playing into his hands, unknowingly following the path he had prepared. At his side, the Viridian Blades Mandalorians moved with silent efficiency, coordinating in perfect synchrony with smugglers and street-level allies. They had learned to trust his guidance, not blindly, but with measured calculation. "All units ready," Loki murmured, voice barely rising above the hum of city machinery. "Patience, my friends. The show is about to begin." In the lower sectors, Kalen Vey and the Inquisitor approached the epicenter of the disturbances. The force pulsed erratically here, a swirling maelstrom of presence, manipulation, and unseen energy. Kalen's senses strained, deciphering the illusions, the misdirections, and the faint threads of Loki's power. The Jedi knew instinctively that the confrontation would not be simple. A mere duel of lightsabers would not suffice. Loki had transformed this engagement into a multi-dimensional puzzle, one where perception, strategy, and adaptability determined victory. The Empire had deployed significant resources in an attempt to contain the trickster. Star destroyers hovered in orbit, TIE fighters patrolled lower altitudes, and elite officers coordinated patrols and strike teams. Yet all efforts were subtly subverted by Loki's manipulations. False reports, phantom movements, and carefully designed miscommunications ensured that Imperial forces would be outmaneuvered at the crucial moments, unable to react cohesively. Loki's first move in the final gambit was to consolidate his alliances. The Mandalorians and smugglers were directed to create controlled diversions, drawing Imperial forces into prearranged zones where illusions would magnify their mistakes. Loki's illusions appeared simultaneously in multiple districts, blending with real combatants to create confusion. Imperial officers hesitated, clones misinterpreted signals, and even the most disciplined units faltered under the weight of perception and unpredictability. From the shadows, Loki observed Kalen and the Inquisitor closing in. He allowed subtle openings, and planting illusions to guide their path toward specific points he had predetermined. The streets became a labyrinth, with environmental hazards, overhead cables, unstable scaffolding, and sparking conduits, carefully orchestrated to challenge, not harm. The duel was as much about psychology and strategy as it was about physical confrontation. When the Jedi finally confronted Loki in an abandoned industrial hub, the God of Mischief revealed himself fully, the green cloak flaring dramatically. Sparks erupted from damaged machinery, casting elongated shadows across walls streaked with neon reflections. "Ah, we meet at last," Loki said, his tone a mixture of amusement and challenge. "I do hope you're ready for the culmination of our intricate dance." Kalen ignited his lightsaber, its blue glow reflecting off the metal walls. Your games end here, Loki. The city, its people, and the Empire will no longer be pawns in your tricks. Loki's grin widened. Games? Oh no, dear Jedi. This is strategy, manipulation, art. And now, the final act begins. With a subtle gesture, Loki activated a cascade of illusions throughout the entire hub. Multiple duplicates appeared, indistinguishable from the real Loki. Sparks flew, metal beams groaned, and shadows danced erratically. Kalen struck with precision, slicing through illusions while sensing the real Loki through the Force. The Inquisitor flanked from the opposite side, her movements enhanced by the dark side, striking at phantoms with lethal intent. Yet Loki had anticipated every move. Environmental traps, prearranged debris, and carefully guided illusions forced both Jedi and Inquisitor to constantly adapt. And every strike was parried, every approach countered, and every assumption questioned. The hub itself seemed alive, responding to Loki's manipulations, as if the city itself were his instrument. Outside, the Mandalorians and smugglers executed the next phase of the plan. Controlled ambushes drew Imperial patrols into zones prepped with illusions and misdirection. Clones fired upon phantom enemies, officers misinterpreted reports, and droids malfunctioned due to minor, subtle interferences orchestrated by Loki. The Empire's counterstrike, despite its vast resources, was collapsing under the weight of his strategic genius. Loki used this chaos to confront Kalen and the Inquisitor directly. His combat style blended physical agility, trickery, and manipulation of illusions. Every movement was calculated to exploit weaknesses, and every gesture served dual purposes, both defensive and strategic. Kalen's strikes forced Loki to adapt in real time, yet even as he engaged, he maintained control of the larger battlefield. Your persistence is admirable, Loki said, deflecting a swing with his staff. But persistence alone will not undo the web I've woven. The duel intensified, with illusions flaring, sparks erupting, and shadows twisting unnaturally. Yet the most significant impact was strategic. Imperial forces, Mandalorians, and smugglers all moved according to Loki's subtle guidance. The city became a living manifestation of his plan, every thread of action contributing to a climax only he could fully perceive. In the midst of the engagement, Loki created a pivotal choice for Kalen: pursue him directly, risking exposure to the illusions and environmental hazards, or divert attention to stabilize the city and minimize civilian and Imperial casualties. The Jedi hesitated, the weight of responsibility conflicting with the desire for immediate confrontation. Decisions, Loki mused quietly, sensing Kalen's inner struggle. I do enjoy the complexity of choice, and now, you must decide which path defines you. Kalen chose restraint, directing attention to minimizing harm rather than seeking immediate victory. The decision played directly into Loki's design, highlighting his understanding not only of strategy, but of morality, psychology, and the subtle art of manipulation. The Inquisitor, frustrated, struck more aggressively, yet even her attacks were subtly guided by Loki's illusions, forcing overextension and tactical mistakes. Each engagement reinforced the God of Mischief's position, and demonstrating that intelligence, perception, and strategic foresight outweighed brute force alone. As the engagement reached its zenith, Loki executed the final move of the gambit. A combination of illusions, environmental manipulation, and strategic placement of allies created a decisive scenario. Imperial patrols were isolated, Mandalorians and smugglers occupied zones critical to maintaining control, and the Jedi and Inquisitor were forced into positions that revealed their limitations without direct harm. Loki stepped forward, fully visible, staff in hand. His cloak billowed dramatically as he surveyed the assembled forces, Empire, Jedi, Inquisitor, and Shadow allies alike. The game concludes, he said, voice carrying with calm authority. Not with victory for one faction, but with the understanding that control, influence, and adaptability define the ultimate power. You may strike, chase, or resist, yet the web is already complete. For a moment, silence fell across the hub. The only sounds were the distant hum of Coruscant, the occasional flicker of machinery, and the barely perceptible sighs of those who recognized the scale of Loki's orchestration. Even Kalen Vey, sensing the culmination through the Force, could not deny the brilliance of the maneuver. The God of Mischief had demonstrated control over environment, perception, and strategic outcomes at a level unmatched by conventional military might. As the night deepened, Loki melted into shadows once more, leaving the Empire, Jedi, and independent factions to process the implications. He had achieved a rare feat: influence without domination, control without annihilation, and a demonstration of cunning that ensured his presence would be felt across the galaxy for years to come. Coruscant remained intact, yet subtly transformed. Patrols, bureaucracies, and criminal networks had all adapted to the presence of a manipulator capable of orchestrating events at multiple levels simultaneously. The Jedi, the Inquisitor, and even Palpatine understood that Loki was not merely a trickster, but a force of strategic genius whose impact would ripple far beyond the streets of one planet. As dawn approached, Loki stood on the rooftop overlooking the city he had orchestrated, a faint smile playing across his features. The board is complete, the pieces in motion, and the galaxy forever changed. Loki had demonstrated the power of intellect, strategy, and manipulation on a scale that rivaled the Empire itself. And the God of Mischief had not relied solely on brute strength. Instead, he used perception, subtlety, and calculated influence to orchestrate chaos, challenge the Jedi, and outmaneuver Imperial forces. Coruscant was transformed, not destroyed, but reshaped by the web he had woven. The Mandalorians, smugglers, and independent factions had witnessed firsthand the power of precision, cunning, and adaptability. Even the Jedi and Inquisitor recognized that stopping Loki outright was impossible without understanding the full scope of his strategy. The Empire, despite its resources and discipline, had been forced into reactive measures, exposing vulnerabilities that would linger long after his departure. As Loki disappeared into the shadows, his influence remained embedded in the city's fabric. Every faction had been tested, and every alliance challenged, and every player had adapted to survive. The galaxy would not forget the presence of a being who could bend perception, manipulate outcomes, and redefine power itself. In the intricate balance of chaos and order, one truth remained. Loki was no mere intruder. He was a force, a master strategist whose final gambit had ensured that his legacy would ripple across the stars. The galaxy did not change all at once. That was the most dangerous part. In the days following Loki's final gambit on Coruscant, there were no explosions, no declarations of war, no immediate purges broadcast across the HoloNet. The Empire continued to function. Patrols resumed, bureaucrats filed reports, senators debated in measured tones. To the casual observer, the machine of galactic order appeared intact. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Information moved differently now. Imperial officers hesitated before issuing commands, not because they feared reprimand, but because they had learned, painfully, that certainty itself could be weaponized against them. Smugglers altered routes not because patrols had increased, but because patterns no longer felt reliable. The Mandalorian mercenary clans quietly revised their doctrines, acknowledging that brute force alone was no longer sufficient in a galaxy where perception itself could be bent. And within the Force, the disturbance did not fade. It lingered. Jedi across multiple systems reported anomalies, moments where the Force felt layered, as though truth and deception could coexist without one erasing the other, as though intent mattered more than allegiance. as though the light and dark were no longer the only meaningful axis by which power could be understood. Master Kalen Vey stood alone in a quiet chamber far from Coruscant, meditating not for clarity, but for comprehension. He replayed the confrontation again and again in his mind. Not the strikes, not the illusions, but the choice. Loki had not sought to destroy the Empire, and he had not tried to overthrow the Jedi. He had not crowned himself ruler, tyrant, or god. He had reframed the board. The Force had warned Kalen of danger, but not of evil. That distinction haunted him. The Jedi Order had always taught that chaos was the domain of the dark side. That deception led inevitably to corruption. That control must be relinquished, not mastered. And yet Loki had wielded deception without hatred, manipulation without cruelty, control without domination. It was not light. It was not dark. It was something orthogonal. Kalen exhaled slowly, realizing with a chill that the Jedi Code had no language for what they had encountered. High above Coruscant, within the Emperor's private sanctum, Darth Sidious contemplated the same truth from a very different angle. Palpatine had not been humiliated, and that was what unsettled him most. The Empire had not lost, the Jedi had not won, and Loki had not taken anything. Yet Palpatine felt it clearly. A rival intelligence had crossed his board, touched his pieces, and exited without leaving a throne behind. Power that did not seek permanence was dangerous. Power that did not hunger was uncontrollable. Sidious replayed the data. Every report, every failure, every moment where prediction had failed. Loki had never directly challenged him, never tested his full might, never forced the Emperor to reveal himself. It was not fear Sidious felt. It was irritation, layered with something rarer, respect. The game was never Coruscant, Palpatine murmured to the empty chamber. No, it was me. Loki had demonstrated something Palpatine had spent a lifetime mastering, the art of influence without exposure. But unlike the Sith, Loki did not bind his power to ideology, lineage, or prophecy. He had not attempted to replace the Emperor. He had proven replacement was unnecessary. That realization forced Palpatine to confront an uncomfortable truth. The rule of two, the Sith philosophy, the Empire itself, all assumed that power sought consolidation. Loki's power sought motion, and motion was harder to kill. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the consequences unfolded in quieter ways. On a dust-choked moon in the outer rim, a smuggler rerouted a shipment, not because patrols had changed, but because he no longer trusted the absence of patrols. On Mandalore-adjacent space, a clan leader rewrote a contract clause, and inserting a single new condition: no engagements involving unknown perception-altering entities. In a forgotten temple ruin, a Force-sensitive cult abandoned its binary doctrine, teaching instead that belief shaped reality as much as energy did. These were not revolutions. They were adaptations. And adaptations spread faster than fear. Loki observed all of it from a place no map could chart. He had not left the galaxy, not truly. Dimensional boundaries were flexible things when approached with sufficient imagination. He existed now in the margins, aboard drifting freighters under false names, within cantinas as a quiet observer, occasionally as a rumor whispered by those who survived improbable encounters. Sometimes he walked openly, cloaked not in illusion, but in anonymity. He listened, he learned, and occasionally he intervened, not to rule, not to conquer, but to tilt outcomes. Once, on a mid-rim world, he nudged a planetary governor into choosing negotiation over annihilation, not through mind control, but by placing the right fear in the right moment. Another time, he redirected a Jedi Knight away from a doomed confrontation, not by deception, but by offering a question the Knight could not ignore. Loki had discovered something exquisite about this galaxy. The Force was not a leash. It was a conversation. And Loki was very good at conversations. He did not underestimate the danger. The Force resisted him in subtle ways. Not rejection, friction. Overuse of illusion drained him faster than it would in his native reality. Large-scale manipulations required patience, recovery, restraint. And this galaxy demanded balance whether one believed in it or not. That suited him. Unchecked power was boring. Growth required constraint. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when Loki felt the pull of the dark side brush against him. Not as temptation, but as recognition. The dark side understood ambition. It recognized cunning. But it also demanded surrender. And Loki did not surrender. Nor did he kneel. The Jedi, for their part, debated endlessly. Some argued Loki was a dark side entity masquerading as neutral. Others believed he was a symptom, not a cause, proof that the Force was larger than their doctrines. A few, quietly, wondered whether the Jedi Order itself had become brittle. Kalen Vey submitted a sealed report to the Council. It contained no tactical recommendations, no pursuit strategies, no calls for containment. Only a single conclusion. Power that does not seek dominion cannot be defeated through opposition alone. It must be understood, or it will reshape the battlefield faster than we can respond. The Council archived the report. Some read it. Some ignored it. The Force remembered it. Time passed. The Empire tightened its grip. The Jedi continued to fade. Rebellion seeds took root. And Loki watched, not as a savior, not as a villain, but as a variable no prophecy had accounted for. He had not changed the galaxy's destiny. He had changed how destiny behaved. Paths multiplied, certainties fractured, outcomes became negotiable. That was his true legacy. On a quiet night, standing on a balcony overlooking a world that was not Coruscant, Loki allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. No throne, he mused softly. No worship. I know chains. He smiled, not with triumph, but with satisfaction. This galaxy will be fascinating. And somewhere, deep within the currents of the Force, something ancient shifted, as if acknowledging that the game it had played for millennia now had a new kind of participant. Not a chosen one, not a destroyer, but a storyteller who had learned how to rewrite the rules without erasing the board. The first lie the galaxy told itself was that Loki had left, not fled, not been defeated, simply moved on, the way anomalies were supposed to, appearing briefly, disrupting the pattern, then vanishing so the larger narrative could resume uninterrupted. Historians would later mark the end of the Mischief event as a clean point on the timeline, a footnote between Imperial consolidation and open rebellion, a strange but contained phenomenon filed away alongside other inexplicable Force disturbances. They were wrong. Loki had not departed the galaxy. He had embedded himself within it. Not physically, not in a way scanners or Sith alchemy could track, but conceptually. He had altered the rules by which outcomes propagated. Before Loki, power in the galaxy moved vertically, emperor to governor, master to Padawan, fleet to system. After Loki, power began to move laterally, unpredictably, through information, perception, and hesitation. The Empire noticed first, not because of explosions or sabotage, but because of inefficiency. Orders took longer to execute, not due to disobedience, but due to interpretation. Officers began requesting clarification for directives that once would have been obeyed instantly. Sector Moffs hesitated to act without redundancy. Admirals ran additional probability simulations before committing fleets, haunted by the memory of perfect intelligence being turned against them. Palpatine felt it like grit in a flawless machine. The Emperor stood before the great viewport of his sanctum, Coruscant's endless traffic lanes streaming like veins of light through the planet city below. The Empire still obeyed him, and the Force still bent to his will. His future sight remained formidable. And yet, there were blind spots now. Not darkness, not absence, noise, too many plausible futures, too many outcomes where variables refused to collapse into certainty. The Force still spoke, but it spoke in conditional phrases. If, unless, provided. Sidious tightened his grip on the railing. This was intolerable. The Sith had always accepted chaos as a tool, but never as a peer. Loki had introduced a style of disruption that did not oppose the dark side. It ignored it. The dark side thrived on domination, on inevitability, on the gravitational pull of fear and desire. Loki thrived on optionality. The Emperor turned inward, tracing the disturbance through the Force. He did not search for Loki's presence directly. That was a novice's mistake. Instead, he searched for absence of collapse, places where futures should have narrowed but did not. Smugglers who should have died but didn't. Jedi who should have fallen but chose exile instead. Planetary crises that resolved not through conquest but compromise. These were Loki's fingerprints. Subtle, elegant, infuriating. "You play a dangerous game," Sidious murmured, unsure whether the words were a threat or an acknowledgement. Across the galaxy, the Jedi Order struggled with a far more existential crisis. They had survived the encounter with Loki, but survival was not victory. The Order had always defined itself by clarity, light versus dark, selflessness versus ambition, serenity versus passion. Loki fit none of these. He lied, but not for cruelty. He manipulated, but not for domination. And he pursued self-interest, but not at the expense of balance. Worst of all, the Force had not rejected him. Master Kalen Vey stood before the council once more, older now, lines etched deeper into his face, not by age, but by doubt. The chamber was quiet as he spoke. "We encountered a being who does not align with our moral taxonomy," he said calmly, and the Force did not correct him. A murmur rippled through the council. "The Force corrects imbalance," another master replied. "Does it?" Kalen asked gently. "Or does it correct extremes?" Silence followed. Kalen continued. "We assume the Force has intent, that it prefers light. But what if it prefers dynamism? What if stagnation, whether imposed by the Sith or preserved by us, is the true imbalance?" That suggestion bordered on heresy. And yet none could refute it outright. And Loki had not increased suffering. He had not plunged systems into darkness. He had destabilized certainty, but not harmony. The Jedi were forced to confront a horrifying possibility, that their decline was not solely due to Sith interference, but to philosophical rigidity. Outside the halls of power, the galaxy adapted faster. Ordinary beings always did. In cantinas and trade hubs, stories spread, not of a god, but of a pattern. Deals that went sideways in impossible ways. Assassinations that failed because the target chose inexplicably to forgive. Battles avoided because both sides suddenly realized the cost exceeded the reward. Some called it luck, others called it fate. A few quietly called it the trickster effect. Loki himself wandered through it all, unburdened by legacy. He wore 100 faces and none of them mattered. On one outer rim world, he lived for weeks as a shipwright, repairing freighters and listening to travelers argue about politics they barely understood. On another, he spent nights in a shadowed archive, reading forbidden Sith texts not to learn power, but to understand obsession. He did not fear the Emperor. He respected him. Palpatine was a master of inevitability, a sculptor of destiny. But inevitability required belief, belief that outcomes could not be escaped. Loki specialized in escape. Still, even he understood the danger of overreach. This galaxy punished imbalance ruthlessly. Every large illusion exacted a toll. Every manipulation required rest. He could not reshape everything, but he didn't need to. Change was exponential once introduced at the right point. The true turning point came not with a battle, but with a choice made by a single, insignificant being. A junior Imperial analyst on a backwater station received conflicting orders regarding a population relocation. One directive demanded immediate enforcement. Another suggested delay pending review. Standard protocol dictated immediate compliance. Instead, the analyst hesitated. For reasons he could not articulate, certainty felt suspicious. He filed a query. That delay saved 12,000 lives. No one ever learned his name. Loki felt the ripple and smiled. That was when he understood the final truth of this galaxy. The Force did not care about heroes or villains. It cared about movement, and Loki had taught it a new step. The Force, across its billions of stars and trillions of lives, had never been challenged like this. Not by Jedi or Sith, not by superweapons or prophecy, not by the machinations of Palpatine himself. The galaxy assumed its currents would flow predictably. Conflict created growth, balance restored through struggle, the inevitable light versus dark, cause and effect neatly contained. But Loki's arrival had torn a subtle hole in that assumption. It began in small, almost imperceptible ways. Across the outer rim, planets that had once fallen into chaos under Imperial oversight began to stabilize themselves through seemingly random events. A rogue engineer repairing a hyperdrive at exactly the right moment, a traitor bartering peace between factions by coincidence, a governor halting an aggressive purge for reasons no one could articulate. And these were not acts of heroism or deliberate morality. They were outcomes influenced by the trickster imperceptibly through invisible threads of possibility. Loki's mastery of perception, misdirection, and subtle causality had transformed him into more than a physical threat. He had become a conceptual one. He no longer needed to wield illusions in direct confrontations. Entire fleets faltered because their commanders hesitated, sensing, without understanding why, that an unpredictable variable existed in the shadows. That variable was Loki. In the heart of Coruscant, in the highest layers where the Empire maintained its control through surveillance, the same patterns emerged. Imperial communications analysts noticed inconsistencies in reports. Patrols that should have been attacked were untouched, orders executed in unusual sequences. Entire operations failing, not because of rebellion, but because of misaligned expectations. The Emperor's observers filed these reports with careful words, hoping to interpret the anomalies as minor, yet each data point only reinforced a terrifying conclusion. Something, or someone, was redefining the rules. Darth Sidious, seated in his dark sanctum, did not dismiss these anomalies as coincidence. His golden eyes, sharp as the edge of a vibroblade, tracked probability streams projected through the Force. There, interwoven among the usual signals of fear, compliance, and rebellion, he saw a pattern that refused collapse. The presence was subtle, almost elegant, like a shadow folding within a shadow, but undeniable. The trickster had arrived in his universe, and while Sidious could not locate him, he sensed him. I felt him in the same way one might feel a cold wind before it enters a room. And more dangerously, the Force, which had always responded perfectly to Sidious's will, now hesitated. It whispered, hesitated, and almost seemed to regard him with mild curiosity, as though it too were unsure how to contain this anomaly. Sidious' hands clenched around the edge of the viewport. He did not fear Loki, never fear, but he acknowledged a truth his ego found uncomfortable. Control was not infinite. Not here, not now. Not when the rules themselves had been rewritten. He could crush armies, choke systems into obedience, even manipulate the Force to predict events centuries in advance. But he could not predict how someone who played the galaxy as a game would move next. Meanwhile, Loki himself moved like a ghost across the galaxy, occupying the spaces where causality bent. He wore many faces, a smuggler repairing cargo pods in a remote spaceport, a maintenance droid in a Coruscant transit hub, a historian chronicling lost myths on a planet that had been erased from official records. He did not intervene overtly. He did not strike fleets or assassinate senators. Instead, he manipulated perception, delayed actions, and nudged events with such precision that outcomes seemed inevitable even when they were impossible. It was an artistry of control without dominion, a concept unfamiliar to both Jedi and Sith. The Jedi observed it as a moral problem. How could a being operate entirely outside the constructs of light and dark, yet affect the galaxy's balance? Their philosophy, their moral axioms, offered no framework to understand this. Meanwhile, the Sith academies dismissed him as a minor irritant until reports of inexplicable inefficiencies began to accumulate. Even then, their response was violent and direct. Fleets were deployed, spies infiltrated, assassination protocols initiated, but each attempt was subtly rerouted, delayed, or negated by choices that had never existed before Loki entered the galaxy. And so the trickster did something unprecedented. He provoked both sides simultaneously, without engaging directly. He challenged the assumption that the Force could be dominated, predicted, or coerced. For centuries, Jedi and Sith had defined power as control over others and mastery over events. Loki defined it as the freedom to reshape perception itself. The consequences rippled outward. Ordinary beings began to act differently, not because of ideology, but because uncertainty became a tangible factor. Decisions that once required no thought now became deliberations. Small variations compounded across systems into massive, unpredictable outcomes. On a distant Outer Rim colony, a farmer chose to delay a shipment of food. On Coruscant, a minor bureaucrat misfiled a report. A Mandalorian clan decided to withdraw from an engagement it had fully prepared for. Each of these decisions, seemingly minor, were threads in a tapestry Loki had begun weaving, threads that challenged the galaxy's assumptions about destiny and inevitability. For Loki, it was a puzzle and a performance. He monitored the outcomes with the detachment of a composer watching a symphony. He did not seek credit or recognition. He had no desire for conquest. His pleasure came from observing the galaxy adapt to him, bending around the variables he introduced, testing its reflexes, and measuring the consequences. But even the trickster had limits. The Force, despite its newfound uncertainty, was a constant presence. It resisted, subtly, sometimes violently. Illusions became more taxing. Manipulations required recovery. Entire planetary systems could not be reshaped at once without straining his energy. And while he could obscure causality on small scales, he could not yet bend the galaxy at the scale of fleets or planetary governments. That challenge, though, was what made it exhilarating. Loki had not arrived to dominate the galaxy. He had arrived to teach it to doubt itself. And doubt, he understood, was infinitely more powerful than fear. Far above, in the Emperor's throne room, Sidious prepared. He had sensed the game changing, and while he could not locate Loki, he knew the confrontation was inevitable. Unlike previous enemies, Loki did not rely on brute strength, not in the traditional sense. Every encounter would be a battle of intellect, subtlety, and perception, a war in which fleets and lightsabers were only the background noise. The first ripple that would herald this direct confrontation came in the form of an anomaly within the Force itself, a subtle signal that carried no anger, no desire, no allegiance, only possibility. Sidious reached out with his mind, probing, expanding, straining, until the impossible truth emerged. This being, this trickster, could reshape the Force's perception of reality without succumbing to it. That was the difference. In response, Sidious did what only he could do, and he began to manipulate the fabric of causality itself, not as a reaction to Loki, but as a preemptive measure. He built contingencies within contingencies, feeding false probability streams into the Force, attempting to ensnare Loki in a conceptual trap before the trickster could fully exploit his variables. And yet, even Sidious realized the elegance of Loki's method. No trap was absolute, because Loki did not move linearly. He moved orthogonally, across planes of perception that the Emperor had never considered, and so the galaxy held its breath. For the first time in millennia, the game of light and dark had a new player, one who could not be predicted, coerced, or fully opposed. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the consequences of Loki's presence would unfold for generations. Every decision, every choice, and every act of perception would now carry a hidden weight. And the ultimate confrontation, the moment when trickster and emperor would collide, loomed closer with each passing cycle of the twin moons, unseen but inevitable.